Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today's is a good one. This is a question that I got from a viewer that I think a lot of us ask ourselves every time we head out to the lake. And that is simply, when do you decide to fish shallow and when do you decide to fish deep? And how do you make the adjustments throughout the day? And I think there's a lot of very important factors that you should take into account when you head out to the lake. Because maybe you only have one day a month to fish, and therefore you don't want to waste half of that day of fishing shallow when you should be fishing deep, or vice versa. Maybe you head out to the water and you're fishing shallow and you feel like they should be shallow, but you're not getting bit. So when do you pull the plug on shallow and head out deep? So it's a very valid question, and it's one I think I can add a little bit of insight into. I think I can give you a couple pointers to look at that'll make you decide whether you should be fishing shallow or deep. And the first has to do with the season. I think the season of the year is always the most important anytime you're talking about fishing. Generally, as a rule of thumb, your fish are going to be, you're always going to have shallow and deep fish. Let me just state that. But when you're talking about like deep fish, a lot of times you're talking about your winter time period, and a lot of times you're talking about your summertime period. The fish are looking for really warmer water during the winter, which they have down deeper, and they're looking for cooler water during the summer, which they have down deeper. In the springtime period, you're talking about a lot of fish that are looking to spawn. A lot of fish are looking for warmer weather from the cooler winter months, and therefore they start pushing towards the bank. The same thing happens in the fall. A lot of times fish start moving up to the bank again, or pushing back into shallower water, because you've got a shad migration or a bait fish migration going on. And the fish are just looking to feed up for the wintertime months. So having a rough idea as to what the fish are going to do during that season that you want to go fishing is going to be a big part of the equation. Now, the next would be, what type of cover does your lake have? If you're talking about a lake that is very full of grass, that maybe grows down to, let's say, 10 foot of water. At that point, a really large portion of your fish population is going to be hanging out around that grass in that 10 foot of water or less. So that gives you a good idea as to where the fish are going to be. If you're on a lake that's got maybe no grass at all, say a table rock, a highland impoundment type fishery, the fish probably are not going to be quite as shallow because there's not as much cover to hold them shallow. And I'm talking about more so in the time periods when the fish aren't going to be shallow. So if you're talking about in the summer months, a good population of that fishery in Table Rock is going to be offshore. So I'm looking at the cover, and one characteristic of a highland impoundment like Table Rock is there's a ton of submerged standing timber. And I feel like anytime you have lots of standing timber, what that does is it gives the fish a lot of habitat to hold on when you're offshore. So if you're fishing, a lake like Table Rock or a lake like Lake Hartwell, lakes that have a lot of standing timber, you find a much better population of fish deeper and more offshore because there's cover for them. So you want to recognize what type of fishery it is. If there's not much shoreline cover or shallow water cover, there's not going to be a huge population of fish that are up shallow during the summer months. There will be some, but you're not going to probably be able to find that jackpot spot, the money spot that's just going to provide you with a bunch of fish. The next thing I always like to look at is, how is your success on the water going? If you've been fishing shallow for 2 hours and you've caught two 12 inchers, maybe you just want to get up and go deep just to mix it up. Maybe go find a deep point that's, in your area, or a deep hump, something that's a little bit different, and give that 2 hours. Because at that point, if you were unproductive fishing the bank already in 2 hours, especially if it was during key time periods, so maybe it was the first 2 hours of sunrise, you probably want to think about mixing it up and moving offshore, because there's probably not a huge population that are up shallow at that on that fishery or in that area that you're fishing in. And the same goes the other way. For me, if I'm practicing for a tournament, I might bop around out deep for a couple hours, and if I'm graphing, not seeing much, if I'm maybe hitting a few spots and not catching much, maybe a few little spotted bass or something like that. At that point, I'm going to pull the plug and go give a couple hours to the shoreline and fishing shallow to see maybe I'm missing something. Just because it's the summer months doesn't mean there's not going to be fish that are shallow, and maybe there's some sort of weird thing happening. A lot of times if you get a late mayfly hatch that pulls a lot of fish up to the bank and you can catch them shallow because they're feeding on the mayflies, even though you think they should be offshore. So you want to you if you're fishing shallow and it's unproductive, go deep for a little bit and vice versa. You want to move around until you start catching fish. That's a huge part of being a successful angler on the water. You need to make that adaptation while you're out there. The next would be figuring out what the main forage is that you're fishing. So if you're on a lake, say in May or June, and you've got a lot of shad and the shad are spawning, your shallow bite's probably going to be much better than it would be if the shad were not spawning. The same goes for a lake like Lake Washita in Arkansas. We used to have the Forest Wood Cup there, and it's got one of the highest populations of bluegill and sunfish that I've ever seen. And you go there in August for that tournament, and most of the time you'd feel like, okay, I should be out deep because it's the water's 90 degrees and it's just there's a lot of cover offshore there. But in that circumstance, because the bluegill population is so strong and you've got so many bluegill that are spawning, there was a huge percentage of the population of largemouth that are up shallow feeding on those bluegill. The same could be said for like fall migration. When those shads start migrating into the backs of creek arms, a lot of bass following back there. So you're going to go from fishing deep to shallow. But having said that, again, if you're not catching them shallow, maybe the bass are sitting on points waiting for the shad to go by into that creek. So it's one of those things you got to adjust. But you have to be familiar with the bait fish. Up north here in the winter months when you would think nothing would be spawning, some of my best lakes have Cisco. I don't know why I was drawing a blank there. I wanted to say smelt, but they're Cisco. And the Cisco come up and spawn in like November, and they're up on shallow rock bars. So if you are aware of that, that's a great time to go shallow and catch some of the biggest fish of the year. It's just one of those things you want to be familiar with what's the primary forage in your lake. And you want to try to recognize what that forage is doing because that will help you determine whether you should be shallow or you should be deep. It's a simple thing. Wherever the food is, the bass are going to be close behind. The last thing I'm going to point out has to do with current. If you're on a body of water that has strong current flow going through it, generally speaking, you've got a good population of shallow fish that are going to be setting up based on the current. Now, having said that, I'm talking more along the lines of, say, a river like the Mississippi River, or if you're way at the top end of a body of water. So if you look at a lake like Kentucky Lake, the further you go up that lake, the more it turns into a river. And generally speaking, the more shallow fish you tend to get, fish that are in 8 foot of water or less. Now, having said that, you need to find the current to make that happen. So as an example, if you're fishing Kentucky Lake again, and you're way up by New Johnsonville and you find a current break that's, right on the main river, right up on the bank, that's going to be a productive spot. But if you go 90 miles down lake towards the dam on Kentucky Lake, you're not going to have that same current coming across the shoreline. Your current is going to be out deep on the ledges. So from that standpoint, just because you might be up the lake fishing shallow current breaks, down the lake, you might be in the middle of the lake fishing currented ledges. So, from that standpoint, you need to recognize where the current is. But generally speaking, if you can find current, the fish are going to be around that current if you're talking about your warm water periods. Now, when you're talking cold water periods, a lot of times they're going to be away from that current. So, again, you need to recognize those points. But that's all valuable information to help you determine are the fish shallow or are the fish deep. Uh, excuse me. If you can take that all into account, you should be able to find the fish and have a more productive day on the water. So hopefully that was helpful. If it was, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Stay tuned. We'll have a new one coming out tomorrow for you.